Good day, everyone. Welcome to the One Open Door podcast. My name is David McKay. This is a place for talks and conversations about spiritual practice and about how to live the teachings of the Buddha right here, right now, in this very world we live in. I hope you enjoy the experience. If you're someone who would like to have support for your own practice, then I would encourage you to go to www.theoneopendoor.org and see the kinds of supports that are available through the Sangha that I facilitate. We've got all kinds of stuff going on. We've got meditation happening at a couple different times now every morning. There's a group happening, a virtual group over Zoom on Thursday and Sunday evenings at 7 Eastern. It's a half-hour meditation followed by an hour-long facilitated discussion. There's this thing that I just started doing. I'm calling it Daily Dharma, where I'm singing out just some little interesting thing every day for people to consider or to inspire their practice. Plus workshops, classes, practice days, all kinds of things. And now that the virus is fading, it appears, retreats. There's actually one coming up in late October, and I just have set up one for the spring. I haven't even announced it yet, but there's one going to happen in April. And so if you would like to participate, I'd love to hear from you. And I'd love to get to know you and find out who you are. And so if you are someone like that, either use the contact form on the website or just send me an email, djmckay429@gmail.com. I'd love to hear from you. Okay, so now on to the program. So to begin today, I have a little thought experiment for you. So see what comes up in response to this. Let's say that you want to set yourself up as a spiritual teacher, and you want to surround yourself with an organization that is centered on you and your teachings. And let's say that you want to do it in such a way that you'll get rich. Okay? So you want to do it in such a way that you attract tons of attention, millions of followers here and there. You put out something on social media, everybody in the world is talking about it, that kind of thing. You want to be able to, this comes out of something that just blew my mind last year. A friend of mine, she lives in a big city, and in the city that she lives in, this very famous spiritual teacher came to that city to do a talk. And by the way, I've decided in this podcast that I'm not going to use names. Later on in the podcast, I'm going to be talking about Buddhist scandals and different things, and I want to talk about them because it's interesting. It's interesting from a spiritual perspective about what goes on with people. So that's why I want to talk about it, not to gossip or anything like that. And so I've decided that I'm not going to use anybody's names, as tempting as that is. And so anyway, so this fellow came, and very, very world-renowned spiritual teacher. And, he rented like a stadium or something, thousands of people, could come to this thing and hear his talk. And she decided she wanted to go, and she found out that he was charging $350 per ticket to get in to watch him talk for a couple hours. And it completely blew my mind. I mean, part of what blew my mind is that, people have that kind of money. I live, I don't live in a world where that kind of money is available. And that people would take that money and, and spend it in that way. They'd spend $350 to hear somebody talk for a couple hours. But much more than that, it blew my mind that he would do that he would essentially only allow people into the talk who have money. And when she told me that, I was like, wow, so this practice that he does, it's only for rich people, evidently. It's only for people who have money. And it just completely blew my, it was astounding that anybody would do that. So anyway, that's a bit of an aside. So that's what you want to be able to do. You want to be able to go into a city, and you want to rent a stadium, and you want to pack that stadium full of people. You want to charge them $350 to be there, and you want to walk away after talking for a couple hours with, I don't know how much that would be, hundreds of thousands of dollars. Okay, and that's what you want. How would you do that? How would you go about setting that up? Okay, so just consider that for a moment. So I've been thinking about this just because I find it to be fascinating. I'm living out here in rural North Carolina, up in the mountains, way back in the woods. And so, when I'm looking at the world from kind of a distant perspective, I don't participate there very much in the world. I live very much, you might say, as a hermit, or like a kind of as a hermit monk in a lot of ways. And so, here I am out in the woods, and I'm kind of looking into the world from a distance, and I'm kind of watching what's happening out there to whatever extent I can see it, which, in my perspective is very limited because I don't have a lot of data, I don't have a lot of information coming in. But it's been fascinating to me to see there's a huge amount of spiritual interest in our culture these days, which is fantastic. I'm really excited about that. This is a really kind of a amazing time spiritually, I feel like, in terms of our culture. There's a lot of reasons for that I'm not going to go into, but I find that to be really interesting, and I find it fascinating to see what form that takes. And that's really what I want to talk about in this program, because not exclusively at all, but by and large, it seems to me that it takes a form that supports ego and supports conditioned mind. Ironically, because of course, from my perspective, spiritual practice is, the function of spiritual practice is to go beyond ego and go beyond conditioned mind. And so it's just fascinating to see that happening. So that's kind of what I want to explore in this podcast. So anyway, so I've been just really curious about that, and I've been asking myself that question, like how does somebody who gets to be immensely popular like that get into that position? And here's kind of what I've come up with. And this is going to sound a bit cynical, and probably is, but there you go. That's what I've got. So of course you're going to need a massive marketing organization behind you. And you're going to need people who are super good at that and really know what they're doing. So, and that kind of stuff. You're going to need all these kind of logistical kind of things. But apart from that, in terms of like what you're offering to people, here's what it seems to me. There's two things that you're going to need in order to attract people on that scale. One is you're going to need to give them away. You're going to need real spiritual information, like true things, like people. Like when you say what you say, people are going to need to feel that there's truth in that. Okay, so not mumbo jumbo. Although actually, if you look around, mumbo jumbo actually does really well too. Okay, there's people out there saying all kinds of crazy stuff that they have, from my perspective, have absolutely no experience of. They're just making stuff up and saying it as if it's true, and people, think it's wonderful and follow them around and stuff. So the mumbo jumbo works pretty well too. But let's say you want to really do this well. Okay, mumbo jumbo is only going to get you so far. You're going to need some real spiritual principles, some things that are universally true. Okay, and you're going to need to present those to people in a way that doesn't threaten their ego. That's what you're going to need to do. Now, why is that? Well, of course, the reason is because almost nobody wants to let go of ego. And when I say ego, what I mean is the self that's created through the processes that we call conditioned mind. It's the place that we basically hide out in. We hide from life in identity, in these places of imaginary safety that we create when we're kids. And, almost everybody is living in, I think, seems to me, almost everybody's living inside an ego identity almost all the time. And people are desperately attached to that. So much so that they have no idea that's happening. They have no idea they're attached to that. That's how attached they are. There's no consciousness that that's even going on. And even if people understand that intellectually, they still really have no idea what's going on generally, because they can't see it. And so what to me, what authentic spiritual practice is about teaching a person to see that they have been taught through the socialization process they went through as a child to identify with a conditioned ego. And they're clinging to that with all they've got. And to teach them how to see into its nature, see how that false illusory, because it is false and illusory, that false and illusory structure is created and maintained, and let that go. That's what spiritual practice is, or at least that's one aspect. That's kind of the negative aspect of it. The positive aspect of spiritual practice, as I've been saying a lot recently in other places, is to directly connect with whatever you want to call, the thing that is in the middle of everything, whether you call it God, life, divinity, reality, whatever it is. But on the negative side, in order to be here and to be in the flow of life, to say it another way, you have to see into, from my perspective, you have to see into the nature of ego. You have to see how you're identified with ego and let that go. And almost nobody wants to do that. Even if you get somebody who swears up and down that he or she or they wants to do that, it's very unlikely they actually do. I mean, not to say that they aren't sincere in feeling like they do, but when push comes to shove, when it actually comes down to, I have to let go of this ego identity that I'm clinging to, it's very rare that someone actually has the willingness to do that. Now, people will have the willingness to do that to a certain extent, which is great. And that's largely what's happening. And I actually think that's fine and good. They'll let go of pieces of conditioning, ways that they see that they cause themselves to suffer, or ways that they sabotage their lives in various ways. And that's excellent. But when it comes down to, I'm going to let go of being this person who I believe myself to be, with all of the opinions and prejudices that go with that, and all the history that goes with that, and the belief I have in, and this is the core of every identity, that I am not the person that I should be, but that I need to be that person, almost nobody is going to be willing to let go of that. And the people who are the ones who will follow a sincere practice. I feel like maybe I'm exaggerating. When I say almost no one, I mean, I actually know any number of people who have that level of willingness. But if you look at it percentage-wise, in terms of just the number of people and how many percentage-wise are interested in such a thing, it's very, very small. So given that, if that's true, and I think it is, it's not going to work for me to offer people a practice who is going to ask them to look into their ego and disidentify from their ego, because almost nobody wants to do that. That's not going to create, 10,000 or 10 million hits, on a something or other. So what I'm going to need to do is I'm going to need to maybe give people like really groovy spiritual things to think about. And I might even include in that groovy spiritual things about going beyond ego. But I'm going to need to do it in such a way, or you're going to need to do it, if this is, your project, you're going to need to do it in such a way that they don't actually have to look. And they don't actually have to let go of anything. Or, to say it another way, we're going to want to set it up so that we teach people to think about spirituality without actually doing practice. That's what we're going to need to do. Now, that can take a variety of forms. So we have a variety of forms to choose from. And when I look at what's going on out there, it seems like it's not necessarily that people are intentionally trying to delude their students, or whatever they call the people who are following them. I think generally that's not the case. I think people in general are very sincere, but don't have a practice themselves of going beyond ego, and so don't have that to offer to other people. And so that kind of what happens. Or the practice that they offer, even if the person sincerely is doing their own work, the practice that they offer doesn't involve the kinds of structures and practices that require someone to do the work of going beyond ego. And that word require, I feel like, is really hits the nail on the head, because you have to be required to do it. That sure has been my experience anyway. When I went to the monastery where I trained, which was set up very overtly and very powerfully, in a way, to help a person go on beyond ego. And as a part of that, had structures in place that required us to look at our stuff. There was really, at the monastery, there was no way around that. You had you had two choices. You either look at your attachment to an addiction to a separate self, or you leave. There's really no other way to be there because everything in the environment required that kind of looking. And there are structures set up for that. There's all kind of feedback and everything that went on. The silence was a part of that structure. And, the teachings, the teachings that we all received all pointed directly at the fact that we're identified with ego and we need to find our way through that. And it gave us tools to accomplish that. If someone has set up a practice that doesn't include those kind of structures or those kind of tools, then nobody is required to do it, even if the teachings themselves are good and helpful. So I'm thinking, as I'm saying this right now, of this particular person who I know about, and another he's not quite on the level of the first person I was talking about, but getting there, getting to be probably heading towards being world famous at this point, and to a certain extent maybe has already accomplished that. And I enjoy listening to what he says because he's brilliant, I feel like, and has a really, really intricate way of talking about like the nature of consciousness and these kinds of things. And I do enjoy listening to it because I find it to be interesting. And there is, as far as I can tell from everything I've heard and what he does, that those kind of structures are not there. So people, and he's immensely popular, and to some extent, deservedly so, because he's got this very clear way of talking about things that I feel like to a certain degree is helpful. But there's nothing, as far as I can tell, there's nothing included in what he offers that actually requires people to look at their stuff, because what he's offering is a way for people to think about what's going on in their minds and think about stuff like the nature of consciousness. And so an ego can do that all day long without feeling threatened at all. It's actually if you want to be an enlightened ego, and I'll be talking more about what that means in a little bit. That comes from my teacher. She would say, beware of being an enlightened ego. So if you want to be an enlightened ego, that's a great way of being an enlightened ego, because you get very involved in thinking about all these different things and figuring out this and that and the other thing about the nature of consciousness. And an ego can do that all day long without having without a person having to consider that I'm identified with ego, like I'm looking at this from a separate perspective instead of being what is being talked about. Now I project onto the fellow who is doing this that I project his practice is sincere and that he is actually doing the work. And someone who is interacting with that practice, I would bet, who also has that sincere intention, probably can make some headway in the direction of seeing into conditioned ego and letting that go. But there's nothing overt about it. There's no structures in that. So, for example, the one thing that I heard him say is, he does these kind of question and answer things, and which is, of course, is typical. And somebody asked a question about karma, and was saying, she was struggling with this or that, the other thing. I can't remember what it was exactly about karma, and she wanted to understand more about karma. And so I'm listening to that, and I have this process focus that I was taught at the monastery, and what's the obvious reply to me is, well, where's that coming from in you? Where's that question coming from? How is the way that you're looking at karma causing you to suffer in the way that you're describing? Because she's basically she was suffering over this, but that's not what he did. He just answered her question about karma, and what he said was, interesting and everything, and maybe helpful to a certain extent, but that's not going to take a person. Like that particular person who asked that question, that's not going to take that person into an understanding of what's causing them to suffer in that degree. Because what's causing her to suffer is an identification with a particular ego place within conditioned mind. And the question was coming out of that. And so if he had directed her attention towards that, then she could have seen how she was causing herself to suffer, and she could have let go of that and been free of that particular piece of karma, if she was willing. And maybe she would be willing, and maybe she wouldn't. But to answer her question doesn't require her to do that. And so it's just fascinating to watch, like, what he does, because it's like I said, immensely popular. People love it. They eat it up. And again, to a certain extent, justifiably so. But yeah, I think part of the reason it's so popular is because people get to be, here's a different way of saying it, they get to be a somebody doing practice, a somebody looking. And it's being a somebody that causes all of our problems. When I say a somebody, I mean a self, a separate self that is created out of the illusion of conditioned mind. That's what causes all of our problems. All of our human problems, as individuals and as a species, are caused by identifying as a separate self. And, from my point of view, what he's offering, even though it's beautiful and interesting in a lot of ways, does not require people to do that. And so, people very willingly participate. Okay, so the first thing that you need is a way to present true spiritual principles that doesn't threaten people's ego identity. Okay, here's the second thing. It would be really handy if you want to make, huge amounts of money being a spiritual teacher. It'd be really handy to be a spiritual ego or enlightened ego yourself. Okay, so what do I mean by that? What is an enlightened ego? I mean, it's probably pretty obvious. It's a self doing practice, right? Let me give you a little illustration. This is something that happened the other day that I found to be just absolutely fascinating. There's a place not far from where I live where it's a sort of retreat center, or at least it looked like a retreat center from the outside. And I'm looking for places to do retreats in the area. I was like, I'm going to check that place out. And it's very beautiful. The property is gorgeous and everything. So I was like, I'm going to check that out. So I reached out to them and I made an appointment to go over there and talk with the founder of the place and get a tour and everything. So I went over there and sat down and talked with him, and it was fascinating because now I'm projecting here, and I acknowledge that I'm projecting. Okay, so I have to qualify that. So what was actually going on with this guy? I don't know. But here was my projection. Obviously, a really good person, a really heart-centered person in the sense that attempting to come from a loving place, not necessarily heart-centered in the sense of being conscious, though. But I'll get to that in a second. But and trying to do a good thing. Okay, so I liked him, and I had a certain degree of respect for him and what he was trying to do. And he's trying to. It turned out to be not so much a retreat center as more of like he's trying to kind of create like a spiritual community sort of thing. And there's people who live there and stuff like that. So I don't think it's going to work out for a retreat particularly. But anyway, it was a fascinating experience. So as I was talking with this fellow, I was really curious going over there because the way he presented himself on the website was just like, I feel like I wonder if I can connect with him. He feels like kind of like a kindred spirit. And so I was really curious to see, who is this person? And as we talked, it became fairly clear to me anyway, and again, I have to acknowledge I'm projecting here, and maybe projecting from my own enlightened ego. That is absolutely a possibility. Maybe there's a way in which I'm doing what I'm projecting in a way that I can't see. And if anybody is aware of how that's so and wants to tell me, I would really appreciate it, okay? Because I don't want to be an enlightened ego. So give me feedback if you see a way that's happening. But anyway, so I was talking with him, and do you know how it is? I bet just about everybody has this experience where you're talking with someone, and no matter where the conversation and what you're talking about, it all is referencing that person and what they think and what they see and things they do and everything. So that conversation was like that. So, basically what we talked about was how great his life has been, how awesome this place is, all these different kinds of like spiritual experiences he had had. And then he would ask me a question, and I would start to answer it, and then I'd get like 10 seconds in, and then he'd take it back to himself. And so it became fairly obvious fairly quickly that okay, well, I'm dealing with an enlightened ego. And that doesn't take away from, I think, just some real goodness that I perceived or projected onto this person. I don't feel like it takes that away at all. And it seems to me that in general, that's the case. The world is full of good, well-intentioned people who are not aware of conditioned mind and not aware of how ego can take over and create a self to be. And kind of in some ways, the most challenging self to see into is a spiritual self, because that spiritual self, has all the lingo and, can kind of present things in a way that is very difficult to see through. It's kind of like, there's, if you think about, like, if you want to hide something, and sometimes the best place to hide it is in plain sight, where nobody thinks to look for it. It's kind of like that. It's like, well, I'm having all these spiritual thoughts, and, and maybe I'm even having spiritual feelings. I'm having, feelings of love and expansion and stuff, which, can certainly go along with that. I must be in an authentic place. Well, not necessarily, because conditioned mind can sort of get behind a person where they can't see it, which is always where it wants to be. It wants to be behind their eyeballs where they can't see it, and can be manipulating that person and orchestrating things such that the experiences they're having, even if they're spiritual experiences, are co-opted by ego and are being used to create an ego. And of course, there's gross, very obvious forms of that, where people who, and if you go online and just start looking around, and you'll see this everywhere, people who have clearly have no idea what they're talking about, have no training whatsoever. Maybe they've done some acid and now they're enlightened, or whatever. All different kinds of forms of that. It's all over the place, where there's people who are presenting themselves as enlightened beings who are clearly just an ego wearing that outfit. But then there's more subtle forms too, and this fellow, I feel like, is kind of in that latter category. So anyway, that was very interesting. And then he actually wanted one of his kind of followers, I guess you'd call it, to give me the tour. And the fellow who gave me this tour is this young man. He's probably late 20s, early 30s, maybe, something like that. A lovely human being, clearly. I really enjoyed this fellow, just full of love and goodness, very humble in these different ways. And, he gave me the tour and showed me all around and everything, and we had a lovely time. And then, I was curious about him. So, because he lives at this place all the time, and, he's evidently receiving some kind of teaching or guidance from the founder. I was like, well, what's going on here, and what kind of experiences is he having and stuff. And so I started asking him about it, and what it appears is going on after he told me a few things is basically he is there and he gets to be an enlightened ego also. That's what he gets for being there. So, and the contrast to my own monastic experience was shocking, kind of, because, he basically gets to do, I asked him, like, well, what do you do all day, and what are your responsibilities? And he couldn't really tell me. I think he just kind of follows his nose around, and, he gets to be whoever he wants to be, and he gets to do whatever he wants to do. As opposed to, like I was saying at the monastery, talk about structure. Everything is there. Everything that happens is a mirror for us to see into, what's going on in our mind, and to unpack the different patterns and processes happening there, and to find that enlightened ego that we need to see and let go of. And so, as far as I can tell, there's no structure at all for that in this place that I had visited. And so, I was looking at that, and in some ways, it's like, well, that seems pretty okay, actually. Because, certainly better than living in an environment that supports just raping and pillaging, the planet or other people to, get rich and, whatever, that kind of thing. Which is, there's a lot more of that going on in the world than what's happening at this place that I visited. So, he's being encouraged to be in a loving, good place, to be a good person and stuff. That's great. I feel really good about it. And I kind of felt sorry for him, because he's not going to get it to any place of real freedom in that environment, unless he somehow does it on his own, despite the fact that the the person who is leading the place is, it seems to me, is an enlightened ego. And so, but I just, and that's, I suppose that's theoretically possible, but the chances of that happening are almost none. And so, at any rate, the advantages to being an enlightened ego, if you want to use the kind of spiritual momentum that's happening in our culture to get rich, is that people will believe you. People want to believe you. I had a conversation the other day, I guess that was just yesterday, with someone who was telling me that she was saying that she's fallen, in very mild ways, kind of fallen victim to to enlightened egos who kind of sort of position themselves in positions of authority in relationship to her, because she's eager for that. She wants somebody to look up to. She wants, and I think this is, I don't know if this is universal, but probably pretty close. People in general are children in themselves, and they're looking for an adult. They're looking for someone who seems like they know the answers and can basically just tell them what to do. And that's what she was saying. She just wants somebody to tell her what to do. And because then she doesn't have to look for herself. And she was copying to this as, a conditioned process she does, and she's working on letting that go so that she can get to a place of where can do real practice and actually get somewhere in her life. But she was describing a karma that she has become entangled with in the past. But that's what people want, by and large, is they want somebody who seems to know what's going on, who can tell them what to do, so that they don't have to find out for themselves. Because the reality is, so I'm going to start to turn towards what does a true practice look like? So the reality is, to me, and this has been my experience, that if someone wants to go beyond ego and let go of conditioned mind and let go of the self that conditioned mind is creating, it requires a tremendous amount of work over time, really for the rest of a person's life. And that work is scary, and it's painful, and it's difficult. So, people at the monastery, we used to kind of joke about this, or the Roshi did, because she would say, people are not banging down the gate to get into this place. The population of the monastery varied between, when I got there, I was number 5. The most we ever got to, we got up to like 12 for a little while, but by and large, it was like between, like 6 and 8 or 9. So a little tiny group of people. And, the teacher was, it's actually quite popular. She had pretty wide reach, and, there are thousands of people who knew about her and practiced with her, but only a tiny amount of people actually wanted to commit on that level. And, and not that there's anything, some people are called to monastic practice, most people aren't. And so there's no problem with that. But what she was pointing to that, I think, is that, people would come to practice, and I think a lot of times would come to practice with this unconscious desire to just feel spiritual, to feel like they're doing something spiritual, because that would feel good. And then they would run into the fact, because that practice was a true practice, and contained the true Dharma, and offered a way for people to escape from ego identity and in suffering. And they would run into the fact that, okay, this is actually a lifetime commitment that is going to require me to let go of everything I'm clinging to. And every time I let go of something, it's going to be extremely painful. And that this is going to require tremendous courage and commitment over time, and probably will go on the rest of my life and will never be finished. And very likely I'll die having partially completed that task, but not completed it. It's like, wow. It's like, no wonder that nobody wants to do that, right? And yet, and here's been my experience with it, and yet, to enter that stream and take on that adventure, the adventure of going beyond ego, is the most exciting, interesting, fascinating, thrilling thing a person can do. Now, it's not interesting or exciting or thrilling for ego, of course, because ego is being let go of. But for the person who lives at center, for the authentic human being, that's as good as it gets in this life. And so, people would come to practice and then they would run into that. And I don't know, percentage-wise, like how many people who ran into that actually survived that realization in terms of their practice and actually continued. Certainly not more than 1 in 100. Probably a lot less than that, actually. And that's been my experience too, as I've attempted to offer practice and facilitate practice. It's, all kinds of people run into this information, but it's very rare that somebody actually wants it and wants to put in the work to acquire it for themselves. And for those who do, then there's this tremendous adventure that follows. And like any adventure, it involves hardship and struggle and difficulty and pain and all that. That's all a part of it too, but it's all totally 100% worth it. And so I have two purposes, I guess you could say, for wanting to talk about this today. And one is just to caution people against being an enlightened ego. And you don't have to set yourself up to be a teacher to be an enlightened ego at all. There's people everywhere who are attempting to do spiritual practice in one way or another and are doing it to support conditioned mind. And, of course, it doesn't have to be as black and white as that. People could be, sincerely, very sincerely letting go of things and trying to be a better person and, operate from a center place and all of that while they're doing it from a place of conditioned mind. So it gets really subtle. And for me, I look at this all the time because, of course, I have to be watching out for this for myself. And I can't even tell you how I'm doing. Actually, I feel like I'm doing pretty well, but it's hard to know because it's hard to know if a person can truly see into what's going on behind the scenes or not. So it is definitely in my awareness that I'm attempting to do my practice and also offer practice from a place that does not support my own ego identity, but it's hard to know if that's actually so or not. And so, but it's something that's on my mind that I pay attention to. And, like any good Buddhist, I'm looking for evidence that would suggest that things are not the way that I imagine that they are. I'm trying to catch out of the corner of my eye places where maybe I am setting up an ego identity through doing practice in some way. And, there's gross and subtle forms of that. And so, the gross forms, and this is where I head into talking a little bit about the scandals that have happened over time. The gross forms are that people will get confused enough that they'll use practice to do things like take advantage of people sexually or embezzle money or both. Both of those things are really popular. I actually, at the monastery one time, the Roshi gave me an assignment, and the assignment was to investigate Buddhist scandals that had happened over time. And the reason she did that was because she wanted me to see what happens to people, and of course she wanted me to, have my best shot at not having that happen to me. And it was fascinating to go in and see what had going on. There had been a lot, and there has been since I left the monastery. There's been several big ones that I know about that have been just really interesting. Unfortunate too, of course, tragic in a lot of ways, but interesting on a process level to see what had happened. And so, anyway, I was given this assignment, and what I realized in doing the assignment is what these, so these people who had set themselves up as teachers, and then had fallen into disgrace. And the thing that was in common with all of them is they had, to some degree, assumed, I think, that they were clear. Some of them even said that they were enlightened, which is kind of shocking to consider. I mean, you got to figure, someone who's willing to say they're enlightened, what's the chances of that person being enlightened? Pretty low, I would say. But anyway, some people did that. But even if they weren't quite so overt about it, I think that they started over time to assume that they were clear, and they set up their organization such that they never had any reflections otherwise. So the people within the organization were essentially required to tell them they're right about everything. And that is a terrible combination. You figure somebody who thinks that already starting to think they're right about everything, then surrounds themselves with people who are telling them that they're right about everything, then that person is going to, over time, lose the ability to see into what's going on with them. And conditioned mind is going to creep in behind the scenes, as it does so well and will do whenever there is an opening. Whenever there is a blind spot, a place where somebody is not looking, conditioned mind is going to sneak back in there and is going to take over, and is going to start, it could take over that person's intelligence and their thought processes and their life force, and is going to live as that person. That's what happened to people. And then, these people would begin to justify, having sex with people inappropriately, or stealing money, or more subtly sometimes, like I'm thinking of this one scandal that happened, I think it was a couple of years ago. Very, very kind of big name person. And I don't think he was doing any of that. I don't think he was doing anything gross like that. But he was emotionally manipulating and abusing his students, according to what people said. It's hard to know what was really going on, but that's what it looked like. So it could get more subtle than just, sex and money. So that's the gross form it can take, but there's more subtle forms too. And you don't have to be a teacher to be using spiritual practice to create an ego in these more subtle ways. For example, I'm doing practice, or maybe I'm talking about my practice or whatever, to get people to look up to me. Or maybe to feel like I'm an okay person and to counteract an idea that I'm really not. Or maybe I'm doing it to attract like a romantic sexual partner who I want, because he or she or they are attracted to that kind of thing. If I can, be Mr. Spiritual or Ms. Spiritual, then they're gonna look up to that, and they're gonna think that's really great, and then I'll get what I want. I'm thinking right now about a fellow who is an acquaintance of my friend Kathleen, who I spent a lot of time with, and he seems, at least from what she's told me, I met him briefly, but it's hard to say just from my experience. But from what she's told me, he's an enlightened ego. He's going around and he's going on these he'll go on a fast, and then he'll come back and he'll invite all these people over to hear about his experiences in the fast, and he's saying all these beautiful spiritual things, and he's probably in his mid-30s, and he's starting to attract younger people in their 20s who look up to him and are starting to look to him for guidance. And then, Kathleen knows, she's good friends with his ex-wife. And I'm finding out, through them, what he, the abusive things that he's doing to his ex-wife at the same time, and also to his kids, the kids that he had through her. Just really just deluded, hurtful, hateful things that he's doing. So that's, I guess, more of a gross example of it too. But then, there's these subtle places where we can become a self doing practice. And so that's one of my motivations in saying all this, is just to give people a heads up. Watch out for that, because that can happen to any of us in gross and subtle ways. And the other motivation is if you're out there and you're looking for guidance, you're looking for someone who can help you in your own spiritual development, to watch out for this, because the world is full of spiritual or enlightened egos who are, offering practice. And so watch out for that. And so in particular, watch out for this person. Do they have real humility? Real humility. Or, can you see any evidence that they're doing this, whatever they're offering in order to prop themselves up and make themselves appear to themselves or other as superior or something like that? And the other thing is, are they practicing what they preach? Because a lot of times people aren't, actually. They're saying, the enlightened egos in the world, they're saying all kinds of stuff, and it's formulaic, because this stuff, what's the truth in terms of, the spiritual principles that could be articulated? Essentially everybody's saying the same things in a lot of ways. I mean, there's just this truth that's there, and it's very simple, and it's not difficult to understand intellectually. And so, a person can be saying what is the truth in a way that's very formulaic without really embodying it at all. And so I think it's important, if you're going to put yourself in a position to learn from someone to see, are they really practicing what they preach? And are they embodying it? Are they being successful? Are they actually, does it seem like they're being centered? Or, are they being an identity instead? And then, the other thing is, I would recommend that you not put yourself in a position to follow anyone blindly. And this is tricky because following, really, truly learning from a teacher does require setting aside one's own perspectives to a large degree. Because if you're holding on to the way you see things, you're not going to be open to what the other person sees. So it does require a certain kind of submission. It also even requires a certain kind of letting go of one's own will and submitting to the will of the teacher. But not blindly. Pay attention. Pay attention to see, what's really going on here. Is what's happening truly for my benefit? Or is this actually happening for the teacher's benefit in some way? Okay, and that can get to be a really subtle place. But when you look at what's going on, the people who fall into, especially the places of just gross negligence, and people are tolerating that, it's because they've ceased to pay attention, they've ceased to question, and they want to believe that the teacher is enlightened. For the reasons I was saying earlier, they want a grown-up in the room that they can follow. They want to be told what to do. So anyway, there's that to pay attention to. So there you go. So the last thing I'll say before I finish with this podcast is, obviously, as I'm saying all this, I'm aware that I'm someone who has put himself in a leadership role within a spiritual organization. The organization that I facilitate is tiny, and it's largely for the reasons that I've articulated, because it seems to me, anyway, that I'm in possession of the true Dharma. Not because, and I don't take any credit for that particularly, but just because it was given to me by my own teacher, and it was given to my teacher by her teacher. It's something that's been passed down. And I'm doing my level best to offer the Dharma in a way that's truly helpful and will truly assist people to go beyond conditioned mind and let go of ego identity. And of course, I'm sure there's all kinds of ways I'm doing that unskillfully. There may even be ways that I'm doing that as an ego identity, very possible. But at any rate, seems to me that the people who come into the practice and stick with it over time are ones who are really sincere and really want to let go of this stuff and really want to experience real freedom in their lives. And it's a beautiful thing. And that's not mostly what people want. But at any rate, I wanted to say that I realize that I am someone who has put myself in that role. And so it's really important that I not fall into the trap that I am articulating. And I don't see myself falling into the trap of, sleeping inappropriately with people or embezzling money. If nothing else, because there's no opportunity for that. I don't have women throwing themselves at my feet, and there is no money to embezzle. And so, so that makes it pretty easy. But even if that was the case, at this point, I don't particularly see myself succumbing to that. Although we'll see if that ever comes to be the case, but I don't ever think it will. But, in more subtle ways, that could happen. It could happen that I get confused and, forget who I really am. And so so it's really important within the organization I'm facilitating that everybody knows that they can offer me feedback. And if they think I'm screwing up or I'm off the rocker or I'm identified in some way, they can tell me. And so I'm putting that out publicly here too, is if you ever see me doing something like that, if you feel like I'm coming from a shaky place, please tell me. Okay? It would be the best thing that you could do for me. And I hope to maintain that attitude of mind for the rest of my life, no matter what happens. Be well, everyone. Take care. Thank you so much for your time and attention. Thank you for listening. Take care, and I'll see you and talk with you again soon. Bye-bye.